With no further ado, please help me welcome Gayle Ross.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. McCann. I want to first say thanks to the Indigenous Scholar Development Center and NSU for allowing me to come and spend some time with you this morning. I did inherit my love of stories and history from my grandmother. She was the family storyteller. She was the youngest of 9 brothers and sisters, born to Chief Ross's grandson, Robert Bruce Ross. She grew up in a small, unassuming little white house a few miles down the road. You can drive by and visit it. It's called the Merle home. Although grandmother was quick to point out once the restoration had taken place that it didn't quite look like that when she grew up there. Her parents, Robert Bruce and Fanny Daniel Thornton. Miss Fanny was a devout Confederate Cherokee from Marble City. Robert Bruce, of course, served in the 3rd Indian Home Guard, Union Cherokee. They met within a few weeks of the end of the war and married within the year. Miss Fanny would explain to her daughters that though he had gone north and I had gone south, in the affairs of the heart, there is no north and south. Their first child was born in 1869. My grandmother was born in 1892. In those days, I guess you just kept having children until the good Lord told you to stop. But one benefit of that was that my grandmother, being the youngest, enjoyed a great deal of closeness and time and attention from her father. He was older by that time. He had turned the running of the family farm over to his older sons. And he told her stories that he had heard, stories of his own experiences in the Civil War, stories of the Trail of Tears from those people who had actually walked the trail. And by the time I came along in the 1950s, my grandmother had inherited that role as the family historian and the family storyteller. And I was very blessed to grow up in a house that, even though we lived in North Texas, my grandmother lived with us. And it was her stories of our family, her stories of Cherokee history that connected me to being Cherokee, growing up so far away from the Cherokee Nation. I want to share some stories with you today. I hope all of you, if you haven't yet, will take the time to go through the Code Talkers exhibit. It is absolutely remarkable. And walk around the corner to the special collections and see the beautiful exhibit that Dolores has put together on her own tribe, the Comanche people's Code Talkers. In learning about the Code Talkers and visiting the exhibit, it seemed to me that there were 3 main themes that appealed to the storyteller in me. And so I've selected 3 traditional stories that I think illustrate some of those main themes. On April 9th, 1865, Ulysses S. Grant stood before Robert E. Lee as the Confederate general prepared to accept the terms of surrender written by one of General Grant's aides. General Grant insisted on introducing all of the members, all of the aides that were with him personally to Robert E. Lee. And when he introduced this particular aide, General Lee seemed reluctant to shake his hand. Perhaps because of his swarthy complexion, he assumed that the man was a freedman, but looking at his features closer, suddenly he realized his error and grasped the Seneca gentleman's hands and said, "Well, it's good that there's a real American here today." To which Corporal Ely Parker is said to have responded, "Today, sir, we are all Americans." While the sentiment may have been noble, of course the words were not true. As Ely Parker knew himself, he had studied the law but been denied admission to the New York bar because he was not a United States citizen. And of course, after the close of the Civil War, the great American war machine rolled west, crushing great Indian nations in its path until by the 1890s, with the massacre at Wounded Knee, foreign federal policy turned from one of physical genocide to cultural genocide. Boarding schools, where Indian children were stripped of their traditional regalia, had their hair cut, forced into military uniforms, and most important of all, taught that their language was worthless. The brainchild of Henry Pratt. Kill the Indian, keep the man. Generations of Indian children who were beaten, shamed, and degraded for speaking their own language. And so to me it is one of the great ironies. Less than a generation later, those same children served the United States with the power of that language. See, the great father in Washington had a vision for his Indian children, that they should become like white men. And the Anishinaabe have an ancient traditional story about what happens when parents cling to their own vision for their children and would deny them the right to be who they are. Long ago, in a village of Anishinaabe people, there lived a man. And he was a well-respected man, a leader among his people, and he had a son. And it was his desire that his son would grow in stature, in manliness, and take his place as a leader of the people. Now, among the Anishinaabe, it is the custom in the spring for the young boys who have reached a certain age to go out by themselves and fast and pray for the vision that will guide their lives. Now, this father was so anxious that his son would be a leader that he wanted him to have a powerful vision. Stronger than any of the other boys, different from any of the other boys. And so, although the snow had barely melted, he took his son to one of the elders. The elders gifted him with his first pipe. The elders painted his chest with the sacred red paint. And the father took the boy out into the woods and taught him to pray with that pipe, to cry for that vision. Now, he left the boy, and all through the night, the boy seeking only to please his father, he prayed, he cried, and at last a vision came to him. It seemed that a great deer walked toward him and talked with him and taught him many secrets so that he would always be successful in the hunt. He would always be able to feed the people. And so that morning, when the father came to the little bark shelter he had built for his son, inside the shelter he heard the boy singing. He heard the boy singing a deer song. He rattled the bark of the shelter. He said, "My son, have you dreamed?" And the boy said, "Yes, Father." And he told his father of the dream, and the father said, "Dear, well, that is a good dream, but surely it is not the only one. Stay out another night." And the boy, wanting only to please his father, did as he asked. And again, through that long, cold night, he prayed and he sang. And in the morning, as the sun was rising, a great hawk swooped down and shared many things with him. And the boy understood the hawk's language. And so when the father returned later that day and said, "My son, have you dreamed?" the boy told him of his dream, of the hawk that had spoken to him and how he had understood what the hawk was saying. Said the father. "A hawk. Well, that is a good dream, but stay out. A more powerful dream is coming." And so it went. Every day the father would go to that shelter, and every day the boy would tell him of some new relative he had made, something he had learned that could guide him on his journey as a man. And every day the father said, "Stay out. A more powerful dream is coming." And on the seventh day, when the father woke up, he saw that it had snowed in the night. A heavy, wet spring snow. And the boy's mother said, "Today you bring our boy home." And she went with the father as they went to that shelter. But when they reached the shelter, it was empty. And they called and called for their son, and finally they heard the boy's voice high in a tree, and they looked, and it was a bird like no other they had seen before, with a bright red breast where the red paint had been on their son's chest. And the bird looked at them with their son's eyes, and one last time they heard his voice. "You took me out too early. You left me out too long. Your dream was more important to you than mine. And I have dreamed. And I am as you see me. And no more will I live with you, but I will return in the spring. In the spring, every year, you wait until you see me in the forest." And so to this day, the Anishinaabe people wait until the first robins return in the spring. Because then, and only then, is it safe to send out their sons to find that vision that will make them men.